Are you really 105? 105 years old. When were you born?
1882.
She was 105 years old, and she had opinions about Johnny Carson's marriages, not polite opinions, not the kind of careful, soft-edged thing you say when you are trying to make a good impression on television. Mildred Holt from Ellsworth, Kansas had heard things. She had been watching this man since 1962. She had done her research, and when she settled into the guest chair on The Tonight Show stage on the evening of August 26, 1987, the very first thing she did was let Johnny know she was fully aware of his track record with women, and she found it, all things considered, pretty admirable. 3-4 wives, she said, with the casual certainty of someone reading from a dossier. That is great. Really good for you. Johnny Carson burst out laughing. Ed McMahon nearly fell off his chair. 300 people in the studio audience erupted into something that was not quite laughter and not quite disbelief, but somewhere wonderful between the two. And Johnny, the man who had hosted over 4,000 episodes of this show, the man who had sat across from Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando and Muhammad Ali and every president of the modern era, looked at this 105-year-old woman from the Kansas plains and genuinely did not know what to say next. He thanked her, warmly, repeatedly. He said he guessed he had just been unlucky in marriage, or something like that, and he just kept trying. Well, she said, entirely unbothered, you are young. You keep trying. That is the right attitude. It had been 4 minutes. The Tonight Show had not yet reached its first commercial break, and Mildred Holt already owned the room completely. What unfolded over the next 13 minutes in Studio One at NBC Burbank would become one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in the entire history of The Tonight Show. Not because anything terrible happened, not because anyone cried or confessed or broke down or revealed a secret they had been carrying for decades, but because a woman who had been born when Ulysses S. Grant was still alive, who had watched the entire 20th century arrive and pass from a small town in the middle of the American plains, sat down in that famous chair and showed 30 million people what a truly, completely, fully lived life actually looks like up close. And it looked nothing like any of them had imagined. Hit that like button right now if you are already with me on this one, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight. This story is something different, something joyful, and you are going to want to be part of it from the beginning. To understand what made that August evening so remarkable, you need to understand where it began. Somewhere in the enormous network of producers and talent coordinators and bookers who kept the machinery of The Tonight Show running every week, someone had come across a small piece in a local Kansas newspaper about a woman named Mildred Holt of Ellsworth, Kansas. She was 105 years old. She had driven herself to the grocery store until 2 years ago. She played bridge twice a week and played to win. She had voted in every presidential election she was eligible for, going back to the days of Theodore Roosevelt. She was, by any reasonable standard, remarkable, and The Tonight Show was always searching for remarkable. The call went to Ellsworth. Mildred said yes without much hesitation. She had a daughter in Birmingham, Alabama, 8 grandchildren, and a long-standing relationship with air travel. She flew whenever she got a chance. Burbank was fine. She would come. The producers were not quite prepared for what they were getting. To understand what it meant that Mildred Holt was alive in August of 1987, you have to let the numbers breathe for a moment. She had been born in 1882. The Brooklyn Bridge would not open for another year. The first gasoline-powered automobile was still 3 years away. The Wright brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk was 21 years in the future. When Mildred came into this world, the American West was still being settled. Cowboys were not a movie genre yet. They were just men doing a job. There were no radios, no movies, no television, no airplanes. The fastest thing most people would ever travel on in their lives was a horse. She had been born into that world, and she was sitting in Burbank, California, in 1987, telling Johnny Carson she thought Jim Bakker ought to be strung up. She was the youngest of 9 children, 6 girls, 3 boys. She had outlived every single one of them. She had outlived her parents, her husband, her entire generation, her children's generation, and was working her way through her grandchildren's. She was the oldest person anyone she met had ever encountered. She said this without self-pity and without particular wonder. It was just the way things were, always the oldest one in the room. You get used to it. August of 1987 was a particular kind of moment in America. Ronald Reagan was in the final stretch of his second term, and the Iran-Contra hearings were grinding through Congress. Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker had just imploded in one of the most spectacular scandals in televangelist history. The stock market was still riding high before October would bring a crash nobody saw coming. And The Tonight Show, now 25 years into its Burbank era, was the undisputed center of American late-night television. Johnny Carson was 51 years old that summer. He had been doing this job since October of 1962. 25 years behind that desk. 25 years of monologues and celebrity interviews and comedy bits and human moments and the quiet, steady accumulation of something that very few entertainers ever achieve. He had become part of the architecture of American life. You went to sleep with Johnny. You woke up the next morning and talked about what Johnny said. He was the warm voice at the end of the day that told you the world was still intact and it was safe to laugh now. And yet even Johnny Carson, after 25 years, still had nights that surprised him. Nights when someone sat down in that chair and the interview became something he could not have predicted. Something that lasted in the memory long after the cameras went dark. Mildred Holt was about to give him one of those nights. On the evening of August 26, 1987, The Tonight Show set had its usual pre-tape energy, the audience filing into their seats, Doc Severinsen warming up the orchestra, Ed McMahon settling into his spot, Johnny in his dressing room, running through his cards, doing the careful preparation that 25 years had refined into something close to a ritual. He knew the broad outlines of Mildred Holt's story, born 1882, youngest of 9, married to a man named William Hope from West Virginia, who she said resembled President Wilson but was considerably better looking, and who had died 22 years ago, leaving her widowed at 83. 83, and still 40 more years ahead of her. What the cards could not tell him, and what no amount of preparation could have predicted, was that Mildred Holt was funny. Not accidentally funny, not charming in the way that old people are sometimes charming because they say honest things without filters. She was funny the way people are funny when they have lived long enough to understand precisely how absurd everything is, and they are no longer even slightly afraid to say so. You are not going to be ready for what she says next. Stay with me. When Ed McMahon announced her, the audience applauded with genuine warmth. Mildred walked out. She moved carefully, the way a person who has spent a century navigating the world moves, but there was nothing diminished about her. She was dressed well. Her eyes were clear and alert, and the moment she sat down in the guest chair, she looked at Johnny Carson with an expression that was not nervousness or reverence or the slightly overwhelmed look that most guests wore in their first seconds on the show. She looked at him like she had things to cover. "How are you, dear?" Johnny said. "Fine," she said. And then, before the breath had even settled, she told him she remembered when he was in New York. She had been watching since the beginning, since 1962, when the whole enterprise launched from a studio in Rockefeller Center. She remembered Ed McMahon from those days, too. 25 years she had been sitting at home watching this show, and now here she was. "My mind is still working a little bit," she said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has nothing to prove and knows it. The studio loved her immediately. You could feel the shift happen in real time. That particular warmth that comes over an audience when they encounter something genuinely real. Something that is not performing, something that is just completely itself. And then came the marriages. "I hear you have had 3-4 wives," she said, in a tone that was simultaneously matter-of-fact and deeply amused, as though she had been meaning to bring this up and here was her moment. The room erupted. Johnny laughed. He said he guessed he had just been unlucky in marriage, or something along those lines, and he just kept trying. "Well," she said, entirely composed, "that is really good for you." He thanked her more than once, with the genuine, slightly overwhelmed gratitude of a man who had been sitting in this chair for 25 years and was suddenly, unexpectedly, not the one running the interview. She had that effect. Within 5 minutes of sitting down, Mildred Holt had quietly assumed control of the conversation, and Johnny Carson was doing something he almost never did in that chair. He was following someone else's lead. What happens in the next few minutes is something you are genuinely not going to see coming. Keep watching. When Johnny asked about her daily routine, she told him in the complete, unhurried detail of someone who has thought carefully about how to live and arrived at a system that works. She got up at 8. She dressed first, then went downstairs. Grapefruit, coffee, toast. Sometimes eggs. Then she made her list and went shopping. Meat, potatoes, fruit, the essentials. She had been doing it this way for a long time, and she saw no reason to change. She had driven herself to the grocery store until she was 103. Let that sit for a moment. 103 years old, and still getting herself to the store. Most people retire from driving in their 70s, some much earlier. Mildred Holt was navigating the roads of Ellsworth, Kansas, on her own schedule, in her own car, at an age that most people will never reach. The reason she finally stopped had nothing to do with failing reflexes or declining eyesight. The reason was a Chevrolet. She had bought a new Chevy. It had power steering and power brakes, and she was not used to power brakes. One afternoon, she had her son-in-law in the passenger seat. She came to a stop sign. She threw the brake on. The power brakes launched her son-in-law toward the windshield. He said she was going to kill somebody, possibly herself. She drove home. She put a for sale sign on the car. She never drove again. Not because a doctor told her to stop. Not because her family staged some kind of intervention. Because she made the assessment herself, measured the situation with clear eyes, and reached a logical conclusion. If she had not done that, she noted with calm certainty, she would not be here today. Johnny looked at her for a long moment after that. "Good for you," he said. "Good for you." She also wanted a highball. This arrived naturally, the way all her best moments arrived, without warning and without any attempt to be funny. Johnny had offered water. She said she would like a highball. Kansas, she explained, was still somewhat dry when it came to spirits, and she did not get this kind of thing very often, mostly at dinner parties. She did not care for wine. She did not care for beer. But this she liked. It was good for the blood, she thought. A certain amount was healthy. She had always believed that. Johnny watched her take her drink with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. He agreed that a little alcohol was probably good for the blood. She agreed completely. She had always thought so. She said it with the serenity of a woman who has held this opinion for roughly 80 years and has never found reason to revise it. She played bridge twice a week. She belonged to a duplicate bridge club, and she said they were all watching tonight. She hoped they were paying attention. She played to win. She also played pitch and occasional penny ant poker, but mostly bridge. She said this with the quiet confidence of someone who has been winning card games for decades and considers it a simple fact of life. She watched 60 Minutes. She watched As the World Turns, though she was provoked by it. Too much kissing. Johnny asked whether she felt there was generally too much of that kind of content on television, too much nudity in movies. She did not care for any of it. She was too old to like it. She said this with the straightforward authority of someone issuing a verdict she considers beyond reasonable debate. The audience laughed. She looked at them with an expression that suggested she found their amusement mildly puzzling. She had simply stated a fact. You have not yet seen the moment that stopped everyone cold. Do not go anywhere. Then she was asked about Jim Bakker. It was 1987. The Bakker scandal had been consuming the tabloids and the news networks for months. Jim Bakker, the televangelist, had been caught in a scandal of breathtaking proportions, and the country was transfixed by it. Johnny asked Mildred what she thought. She did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. "They ought to string him up," she said. The studio came apart. 300 people laughing simultaneously with the kind of surprised, helpless laughter that you cannot manufacture because it comes from somewhere genuine. Johnny looked startled for exactly 1 second before he wrote it. He suggested, mildly, that stringing him up might be going slightly overboard. Perhaps. She was unmoved. She thought it was awful what he had done. She had said what she said. She stood by it. Then came the president. She liked Reagan, she said. She was a Republican. She had always been a Republican. His first term had been great. His first 4 years, very good. But since the nose operations, she said carefully, weighing each word, he had not been quite as sharp as he was before. Johnny processed this for exactly as long as it took for the audience to catch it, which was not very long at all. He agreed that too much surgery on the nose might indeed have consequences. He said this with complete, dignified composure. The studio was in tears. Mildred looked out at them and appeared mildly puzzled again. She was simply observing what she had observed. She had been watching presidents since Theodore Roosevelt. She had more data points than most people alive, which brought them, naturally, to Teddy Roosevelt. Johnny asked who the first candidate she had ever voted for was. Theodore, she said. She had voted for Teddy Roosevelt. She remembered him. He went to Cuba and won the war in a month. That was the kind of man he was. She had been 16 or 18 at the time, and she had a boyfriend who was going to go fight, and she had been terrified. But it was all over in a month. Teddy had seen to it. She had voted in 21 presidential elections. She had watched every single American president from McKinley to Reagan move through history, and she had opinions about all of them. And she was willing to share those opinions, and if her most recent concern was the effect of nose surgery on a sitting president's cognitive sharpness, she had the standing to raise it. By now, the interview had moved into a different register entirely. The early laughs were still warm in the room. They would always be warm in that room. But something else was happening underneath the laughter, the way something always happens underneath the laughter on the nights that matter on The Tonight Show. The audience was doing what audiences do when they encounter something genuinely rare. They were leaning in. They were listening with a different quality of attention. They were present in the way people are present when they understand, without being told, that they are watching something they will not see again. Because 1882 was not just a number. Mildred Holt had been alive when Abraham Lincoln's contemporaries were still living. She had been alive for the sinking of the Titanic, for Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic, for the dropping of the bombs on Japan, for the first human footstep on the moon. She had watched Prohibition arrive and depart. She had lived through the Great Depression and both World Wars. She had buried a husband and outlived her entire family of origin, and kept getting up every morning and making her list and going shopping and flying to Birmingham when the grandchildren needed her, and playing bridge twice a week and never, not once, decided that the accumulation of years entitled her to stop showing up. When Johnny asked whether she had ever considered remarrying after William died, she said no. He pressed gently. She said she never had a chance, and the way she said it was something only she could have managed, something that landed simultaneously as a joke and as a truth and as a small, complete, fully accepted piece of her life. A widow in her 80s in Ellsworth, Kansas. The suitors had not exactly been lining up. She had assessed the situation, found it logical, and moved on without drama. She was going back to Kansas tomorrow, she told him. She had flown out. She would fly back. She flew whenever she got a chance. She was not remotely intimidated by airplanes. She had watched them be invented. She had been 21 years old when the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. She had decided very early on that she was going to take advantage of the world as it was, rather than grieve the world as it had been. When Johnny told her she was the oldest person he had ever met, the oldest person he had ever had on the show, she nodded. "That is the way it is at home, too," she said. "Always the oldest one anyone has ever met." She said it with a shrug, a single, complete, untroubled shrug. And somehow that shrug was the funniest and the most profound thing anyone had said in that studio all evening. Do not go yet. What I am about to tell you about this broadcast is the part that has lasted. At the close of the segment, Johnny told her she was a remarkable lady. He meant it with everything he had. The studio could hear that he meant it. He asked if she was staying a few days in California. She said she was going to Kansas tomorrow. He handed her something small to take with her. He called her lovely. She thanked him, graciously, without ceremony, without the performance of gratitude. Just the clean, unadorned thank you of a woman who is accustomed to being herself in any room she enters and does not require the room to make a big deal of it. And then she was gone. Back to the duplicate bridge club and the grocery shopping and the grapefruit and coffee every morning and the flights to Birmingham and the 8 grandchildren and the decade after decade of ordinary mornings in a small town in Kansas where she was, as she had always been, the oldest person anyone had ever met. Here is what that interview was really about and why it has lasted the way it has. Johnny Carson spent 30 years building a career on the premise that the most interesting thing about any human being is what they are actually like when the performance drops and the truth comes through. He had a gift for creating those conditions, an almost inexplicable gift. Stars who had never shown vulnerability on camera became vulnerable in that chair. Celebrities who spent decades behind carefully constructed public images let those images slip, sometimes for just a moment, and in that moment something real moved through the room and everyone watching felt it. With most guests, that truth arrived through difficulty, through confession, through grief, through the moment when the weight of something long carried finally became too heavy to hold alone. Mildred Holt produced that truth through something different, through the radical, uncomplicated, completely unperformed fact of a life thoroughly lived. She was not trying to be charming. She was not playing a character. She was not performing the role of wise old woman for the camera's benefit. She was just herself. And herself, as it turned out, was someone who had been building a life since 1882, brick by careful brick, through war and loss and joy and the quiet daily discipline of getting up and making the grapefruit and the coffee and the list, and who had arrived at 105 years old, with her mind working fine, her opinions fully formed, and absolutely no intention of apologizing for either. She had driven until the car became dangerous, and then she stopped. She had married once and loved her husband, and when he was gone, she accepted that he was gone, and she kept going. She had watched every president from Teddy Roosevelt, and she had strong opinions, and she was going to share them. She did not care for too much kissing on television. She liked bridge, and she played to win. She liked a highball occasionally. It was good for the blood. That is what 105 years looks like, if you live them right. Johnny Carson sat across from her and understood something. Not the kind of thing you can articulate immediately, the kind of understanding that settles into you slowly, after the cameras have gone dark and the studio has emptied and you are sitting with the evening's residue and you recognize that something happened tonight that was different from what usually happens. He had interviewed thousands of people. He had asked the question of how to live in thousands of different ways. He had heard thousands of answers. Most of them said some version of the same thing. Cherish what you have. Be present. Love the people around you. Don't wait. Don't delay. The years go faster than you think. Mildred Holt didn't say any of that. She didn't have a speech. She didn't have a lesson prepared. She had a highball and some opinions and a flight to Kansas in the morning and a bridge club waiting at home. She was not trying to teach anyone anything, and that was the lesson. The recording of that broadcast has been watched by millions of people in the years since that night. People describe something they struggle to name precisely when they try to explain what it does to them. Something between laughter and tenderness. Something about the beauty of a life still fully in motion at an age when the world has long expected you to have wound down. Something about what it means to still have things to say, still have things to complain about, still have opinions about the president's nose and the state of television and the proper way to operate a power break at 105 years old. Mildred Holt refused to be invisible. She flew out to Burbank, California, won the room inside of 4 minutes, had her highball, told America what she thought about Jim Bakker, and flew home to Kansas the next day. She had been born into a world without airplanes. She flew home in one. That is what a life looks like, when you live it all the way to the edges. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992, 5 years after that evening. In 30 years of hosting, he had interviewed roughly 22,000 guests. He always said the ones he remembered most were the ones that surprised him, the ones that arrived carrying something unexpected and left him with something he had not had before. Mildred Holt surprised him from the first sentence. She surprised him with her memory. She surprised him with her humor. She surprised him with the completeness of her, the sense that this woman had not been waiting for a television appearance to make her real. She was already entirely real, had been for 105 years. She was simply gracious enough to share some of herself on her way back to Kansas. And what she shared was not wisdom dispensed from a height, not advice, not the carefully packaged lessons that guests usually bring to talk shows when they want to leave the audience with something to take home. What she shared was just herself, exactly as she was, opinionated and warm and funny and clear-eyed and completely, entirely unafraid. That, finally, is what 30 million people felt when they watched her that night. Whether they named it or not, they felt what it looks like when fear is completely, permanently, unambiguously gone. When you have lived long enough and through enough, that the things most people spend their whole lives being afraid of have already arrived and already passed, and you are still here, still making your list, still playing to win, still having the highball when you get the chance. You become, at some point, someone who is simply no longer afraid. And that, it turns out, is the most beautiful thing a human being can be. If this story moved something in you tonight, smash that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you moments from the Tonight Show stage that deserve to be remembered. Moments when something real broke through the cameras and landed in living rooms across America and reminded people why being alive is extraordinary. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the years do not have to diminish you, that every decade can add something rather than remove something. That somewhere in Ellsworth, Kansas, there is a version of a life that shows you what arrival looks like. Hit the hype button if you can. It helps more people find stories like this one, and it means the world. And drop your country in the comments right now. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Tell me about the oldest person you have ever sat with. What did they teach you, whether they were trying to or not? Because sometimes the most important lessons do not arrive in speeches. They arrive in the way someone takes their drink and looks at you and tells you they are too mean to die. They arrive in a shrug that contains 105 years of morning after morning after morning. They arrive in the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who has been here long enough to know exactly what matters and exactly what does not. Mildred Holt knew. She had always known. And for 13 minutes on a Tuesday evening in August of 1987, she let Johnny Carson and 30 million Americans know it too.